All right. This is Mac Bolin, and I am here with Kevin Drendel. This is my second episode of Seriously, People, and tonight we're talking immigration. Now, this has been a hot button topic for a long time, and I'm going to go through, a lot of history. You've probably heard a lot of the impassioned stuff. You've probably heard a lot of the emotional stuff. From time to time, both parties have been involved in hypocrisy over political issues. Right now, though, I got to point the finger at the Democratic Party being hypocrites over this issue. I will explain a little bit more on that later. Some of the sources I will probably bring up. There was an article, Adios, California, some of the Ann Coulter stuff, Chicago Tribune, Meet 40 Dreamers, and, of course, a lot of the information you can look up on the BLS, Department of Immigration, and, of course, USCIS, which every U.S. embassy has. And I'm here with Kevin Drendel, and we're going to talk about this, and he has also a perspective on this, and actually a family perspective on this, I would say. Yeah, I'm going to welcome him to the program here. So just to start off, I'm going to talk about personal stuff now, me personally. You hear all the time, they say we're a country of immigrants. True. We're a country of settlers. We're a country of conquerors. And even after almost a century after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, we were a country of slavery. And history is something a lot of times people want to look back on, and you can't change history. You can't change, you have the good, but then you have the ugly. You can't change the ugly. And if you ignore the ugly, then you're stupid. And one of the things that you need to look at is all of that. Now, me personally, the Bradford side of my family fled England with the Pilgrims. Governor Bradford was my ancestor. They came to the U.S. to flee persecution and start a new life. And they actually developed a decent relationship with the Native Americans because their motivation for coming to the New World was different. The other Europeans that came, motivated by Congress, by commerce, exploration, etc. Well, down the road, then, the Keating side of my family came to the U.S. as Irish immigrants fleeing famine and violence over there. And at one time, the Irish were the most despised immigrants in this country. And if you ever see the movie Blazing Saddles, which is offensive on pretty much every level, but funny as hell, there's a scene in there, and, look it up. We don't want the Irish. I laughed my ass off at it because I actually understood the context in which it was placed. And if you saw the movie Gangs of New York, the rioting was perpetrated by Irish immigrants. And there's a lot of fiction in that movie, but the fact is that they were rioting and they were being drafted, conscripted into the Union Army, and they were blaming African Americans for it. And they literally ran through the streets of New York, rioting and literally beating, lynching, and killing every black person they could lay their hands on. And that's part of the lineage, or, whatever you want to say, the history that that you have to deal with. And one of the reasons why the Irish were so hated. And you had, during the Civil War, a lot of Irish that were conscripted. A lot of my ancestors fought in Meagher's Irish Brigade. And ironically, if you ever see the movie Gods and Generals, they ended up charging the heights outside of Fredericksburg, facing the Atlanta Irish Brigade, and literally murdering each other right across a field. Very emotional moment. But again, that's part of history. And I had parts of my family fight on the Confederate side and parts of my family fight on the Union side. Again, that's part of history. And I won't go any further than that. And go ahead, Kevin, give yours, because I know you have plenty of immigrants in your family.
Most of us do. As a matter of fact, all of us do. Thanks for having me, first of all.
You're welcome.
We've obviously had some discussions on social media. Yeah, so I, on my mother's side, the Kimballs came from England, also with the Puritan movement here to the New World to get away from persecution, and settled just north of Boston. And there were some other immigrants also on my mother's father's side that came from England as well, not quite that early, but they were part of the westward expansion in Massachusetts. And they actually, one of my ancestors was captured by the Indians who were fighting back and pushing back against the westward expansion. And they were marched in the snow up to Ontario.
Wow.
One of my ancestors was pregnant during that march up to Ontario. And they ended up being rescued by some French explorers and found their way back. But obviously, you know, they came here escaping a tyrannical English environment. On my father's side, I have ancestors who came from France later in the mid 1800s, but they were farmers, and they were also getting away from probably being conscripted into Napoleon's army for one of his wars,
right?
And looking, for a better life for themselves and their kids.
Yeah, and a lot of people, if you go back in history, you're going to find out some really interesting things. Like if you look at the Spanish when they came over here, and particularly in Latin America, they faced two highly organized societies in the Mayans and the Aztecs. Now, North American Native Americans were pretty much nomadic. And the great irony here is, particularly, let's talk about the Plains Indians. If you look at the Sioux, the Cheyenne, etc., one of the things that helped their civilization flourish was the introduction of the horse, which, transformed, nomadic people who couldn't move very far. Suddenly now, with the introduction of the horse from the Europeans, their tribes were able to flourish. Which is just, it's a little bit of a side point there that I always like to mention. If you know history, that's one of those things that's just fascinating. And you're talking about, like with the Aztecs, millions of Mesoamericans in a very highly developed society. Well, other than the fact that they still sacrifice people to the sun god. But the conquest of North America, South America, the exploration, it happened. It doesn't change facts. When people will always say, well, we're this or we're that. Well, you know what? It's part of history. Muhammad conquered the Middle East, North Africa, even made it into Europe. It happened. It's part of history, something you have to accept. Now, fast forward to modern times, and talking about immigration, and again, I'm going to talk a little bit on the personal side. I grew up in the Chicago area. I used to live in Morris, Illinois. Folks got divorced, moved up to the Chicago area. One of the first families that I met in wrestling, the Ordonez, were Cuban refugees. And when you go back in my lifetime, the first influx of refugees into the United States in my lifetime, and of course there's been tons of refugees that have come in through history, and I mentioned the Irish, and at one time they were all hated, the Italians, Polish, you can go on. And speaking of the Polish, here in Cook County and the city of Chicago, we still, the city of Chicago still recognizes Kazimierz Pulaski Day, which is a Polish, celebrated by the Polish neighborhoods. And if you don't know who Casimir Pulaski is, he was one of the people who helped organize the first American cavalry. Anyway, point being that being a U.S. citizen and the freedom that we allow in here, you can be both. And I'm not a big fan of Trevor Noah, but he mentioned it specifically in his show when he was talking about the French soccer, well, football, but we call it soccer team that won the world championships. And, you know, he caught a ton of flack for it. And he said, well, the nice thing about being in America is I can be an American first, but I can also celebrate my culture. And we have that here, you know, with St. Patrick's Day, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if you know about what happened in Cuba back in the 50s and when Castro took over, a lot of people fled Cuba because of the Castro regime. And when they came over here as refugees, they literally had to give up everything. I mean, if you were a sugar plantation owner, whatever, and you left Cuba, you left everything behind, all your money, everything you had, to come to the United States. And that was, in my lifetime, you know, the first influx, we would say, of refugees. Now, I'm going to speak about more of that later on, but I witnessed that firsthand, and people who came over here and literally had to start from ground zero. And the guy I'm talking about came here and got involved with Good Humor and started up. He eventually became like a regional manager and, you know, earned a really decent living as a refugee. Kevin.
Yes.
Your thoughts.
Well, you know, we're the melting pot. We're the place where the huddled masses gather on our shores. America, United States of America, is the grand experiment, unlike any other country in the world, formed by freedom-loving people escaping tyranny and persecution from other places. You know, that is our legacy. I know that there's a popular sentiment that tends to be apologetic about our legacy. I don't think we should be apologetic about it.
Absolutely not.
The world has always been a pretty brutal place. There have always been people who conquered and people who were conquered. That's the way the world has always operated. Really, only as we get into the 19th and 20th centuries do we see a shift toward a more, I suppose you could say, civilized view of the world. And the United States is somewhat unique, I think, in taking upon itself a responsibility to be a model in the world, I suppose. Obviously, you know, here we are now in the 21st century, and like you said, the past is the past, and the past doesn't necessarily define or determine how we move forward. But you know, I think we should borrow from the best of our past and try to avoid the worst of it. And from my perspective, because we are a nation of immigrants, you and me included, and almost everyone probably who will listen to this podcast, I advocate for a compassionate attitude toward immigration, and that's where I find myself now. Is trying to find a balance in that space, somewhere in between the extremes.
Right. And speaking of extremes, because on the one hand, you have some people who want to restrict immigration to the point where, you know, you say, okay, well, these people we don't want, these people are okay. And that's not really what we were founded on. And then we have the other extreme, though, where people say, well, let everybody in. We want open borders, no detention, no ICE, open borders, just let everybody in, which is, you know, pretty much insane. And somewhere between there, we have to find the middle ground.
Agreed.
Now, again, doing some research on this, and, you know, again, we go up this run up. I'll go to 1986 now. I'm going to fast forward when Ronald Reagan was president, and there was a great bipartisan movement because at that time we had a huge influx. In 1979, you had the Mariel Boatlift. Now, I was in the military. I was in the 82nd Airborne at the time, and this time, unlike the first Cuban, you know, influx we had of refugees, this was a little bit different in that Castro said, okay, well, you want our political prisoners, et cetera. Well, you're going to have to take everything. And what he did is he literally emptied all his jail cells, and we got everything. We got gang members, we got prostitutes, drug addict, we got everything. I mean, in 1979, he sent everything over here. And so we had was known as a Cuban resettlement. Now, part of this, and if you saw the movie Scarface, I mean, it was fiction, but you kind of saw the ground floor of what developed eventually into a massive drug crime syndicate in Florida. And if you've never seen it, I would highly recommend you see either one of the two documentaries, Cocaine Cowboys or The Godmother, and it'll give you a real idea of what happened in Florida during that time frame. Now, that was different than the earlier one. Now, at the same time, during the 80s, you had a lot of turmoil in Central America. You had turmoil in Honduras, Nicaragua, and obviously the full-blown civil war in El Salvador. And the U.S. experienced a massive influx of refugees fleeing all of those conflicts. Now, eventually, Nicaragua and Honduras worked itself out, and then actually down the road even did El Salvador. Now, pointing this out, particularly with El Salvador, at the time, a massive amount of these El Salvadorian refugees settled in the Oakland area. For the most part, they were good, but they came into a very volatile situation where, you know, Oakland, LA, San Francisco, you had a lot of gangs there, Bloods and Crips I'm talking about. Well, eventually those El Salvadorian refugees in Oakland spawned the gang, which of course has been all over the media now, known as MS-13. And, you know, I don't want to go too often to a tangent on that, but, you know, this eventually evolved into a very hardcore, violent drug gang. And now that represents the most negative side of immigration that we experience. And talk about, you know, I saw a link at one point that said, well, immigrants commit less crime than citizens. Well, those were raw numbers, which you need to look at. And I went to the 2017 Department of Justice numbers, and illegal immigrants have a higher crime rate, keyword there being rate, than naturalized or native-born citizens. And
I've actually
the reason
seen
for that is
opposite.
for gang, and let's face it, the reason for that is because of the gang crime.
Well, I've actually seen a lot of studies, and I've read some of them, and the majority of studies actually come to an opposite conclusion. And I know there are exceptions, and you've indicated a couple, but on the whole, people who are coming here to find a better life, and who end up being here illegally, either after a visa lapses or for whatever reason, they actually tend to, the they tend not to want to rock the boat, because if they do, if they bring attention to themselves, they're susceptible to being deported, and they don't want that. And what actually happens, and I think you'll find law enforcement, especially in larger cities, verify this, is they actually become victims of crime, and they don't report it because for fear.
For fear of deportation. Well,
exactly.
Well, that's why I say specifically the Department of Justice numbers, why they have the higher crime rate amongst illegal aliens is specifically due to that particular portion that I mentioned. Right. Not the ones that are overstayed visas, not the ones that are the people you're talking about. I'm talking about specifically in some of these guys, and as well as I do, that have been deported 4 or 5 times and still sneak back in and commit crimes. And that's just reported crimes, not the unreported crimes. As we know, a lot of the gang violence does go unreported.
Right.
Like I said, so that's why I said that's the extreme ugly side of illegal immigration. Like you mentioned, most illegal immigrants are people who came here on work visas or student visas and overstayed their visas. And they don't represent that portion of it. Now, speaking of, and I want to point to a Chicago Tribune article I read that said, 40 dreamers, and talk a little bit about executive orders. And the 2 executive orders, first the deferred action on child arrivals, and then, of course, the sanctuary city thing, which I think is an abomination. The thing is, and I went to the U.S. Bureau of Immigration site, and I want to talk just a little bit now about what the law says and what the requirements are. And one of the things I noticed is amongst all these 40 people they mentioned, the Chicago Tribune article, is every single one of these persons had an opportunity to apply for legal citizenship, and none of them did. And that's my question. Okay, you have been in this country 15 to 20 years, but you never bothered to apply for citizenship. Why? That is my question.
I think there's some answers to that.
Well, and there are. Oh, no, I know there are. But the point is, there is a process, a legal process. And, we want to be compassionate. But at the same time, there is a process. And if you go to the Immigration Bureau site, basically, one of the things is you have to have 5 years uninterrupted of residency in the United States. And in most cases, then after that point, you can file for an application. That's anybody who's here legal on a work or a student visa.
Right.
And before I go any further, let me explain a few legal terms here. Okay, there's migrant workers, which you mentioned before. Migrant workers are people, say, who come across the border from Mexico, go to Texas, Arizona, etc., strictly for the harvest. And there's a good reason why they come for the harvest, because they're the best, most talented, most hardworking people at harvesting. And that's why they get hired by all these farmers. And they come, they get paid, and then they go back to Mexico. Then you have, what we will call either undocumented, using the PC term, illegal alien, legal immigrant. Now, some of these people are people who cross the border illegally. Some of these people who came to the country legally, and then, as you mentioned, they overstay a student or a work visa. And that pretty much, in a nutshell, covers immigrants. Now, then you have people who come legally, say through a point of entry, and then work here and then file for legal status, and they become what you call a naturalized citizen. And then, of course, a native-born citizen is someone who is here in the country, is born here, basically. And that pretty much covers everything.
So we're probably going to get into the 1996 immigration reform. And obviously Clinton was in office when that was signed into law. He signed it into law. He actually ran on a platform that was tough on immigration.
Yes, he did.
But of course, it was the Republican Congress that introduced the bill and got it approved through Congress. So
yes,
it was a multi-party effort.
Bipartisan. Yes, it was.
And that law tightened the screws on immigration. It became more difficult to immigrate legally. It became almost impossible to become legalized if you were illegal. And in my opinion, that's what needs to be overhauled. We need to find a balance between, we have to have vetting. We can't allow criminals into the country.
Absolutely.
But we have to find a better way, a more effective and streamlined way of processing people to citizenship. And frankly, I just read an article the other day that in the Northwest, there's fruit and there's vegetables that are rotting in the fields because they don't have enough workers to work those fields. They depend on the immigrants, the migrant workers in particular, to work the fields, and they don't have enough people working those fields. I know in our area we've got a couple of industrial parks close by Batavia, West Chicago, and around, and they're all struggling to find workers for their factories. Our kids are not working in the factories; they don't want to, and we have a need for workers. Our population is aging. And our population is not growing. For the first time, I want to say in 2017 or 16, I don't remember which year, we have hit negative population growth in the United States. And we will not have the workforce to sustain things like Social Security and Medicaid for us, for the baby boomers and the people coming right after us who are aging and obviously living longer because medicine has improved. So we need to find a way to be able to process people towards citizenship. I think we need to get rid of the lottery. I mean, you could immigrate perhaps in 5 years, but it could be 20, and it really depends on chance.
There's two parts to that now, and a lot of people who file and do it properly are citizens in 6-7 years. Part of the problem is, and you kind of touched on it. Some people will come in, and if they had just filed for citizenship,
right,
while they were still on work or student visas, it would have been an easy process. But then they become illegal, and that sets the whole situation back. And then there's some people, and I've witnessed actually in the military some of the horror stories because of a guy who came here as he came here from Scotland with his family. He was still not a citizen, joined the army, but he got booted out on a bad conduct discharge, and then he decides to file for citizenship. Well, you're probably not going to be approved at that point.
I think part of the problem is ignorance of the law.
Absolutely.
And the Immigration Reform Act is not really inviting. So, if you go to, and it's a labyrinth of laws. It's a labyrinth of rules. It's a bureaucracy. It's not efficient. It's not effective. I don't do immigration law myself, but I do know people that do immigration law. And so I hear them talk about how difficult it is, even if you're an attorney, to navigate the waters can be kind of daunting. So I think part of the reason why people don't file is because they don't have the resources to hire an attorney, and they don't know what the laws are, and they're afraid of getting caught up in a bureaucracy that's going to chew them up and spit them out.
Well, and again, if there was a little bit more information, and a lot of these people who, well, and first of all, I'm just going to say straight out, if you cross the border illegally, that's a crime, period. There are legal ports of entry, and if, and this is, again, if you don't know it, if you go to a U.S. embassy, and I've saw it, I've been deployed all over the world, and every U.S. embassy has a USISE. It's a United States Immigration and Citizenship Service. And if you wanted to apply for a legal visa, you go to one of those offices. And when I was in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, on a security mission, but that office literally had a line of people every single day. And again, that was in the 1980s, right around 1985, I believe, of people requesting visas to the U.S. And for the most part, if they weren't criminals, they were granted.
1986.
And, yeah, again. And if you know the visa process, you can come over on a tourist visa, a student visa, or a work visa. Part of the problem is, a lot of these people will not bother to file for citizenship while they're on those visas, and then they become illegal. And obviously, once you're an illegal alien, it is much, much more difficult to try and get citizenship, because according to law, you would have to leave the country for anywhere from 5 to 10 years, reapply for a visa, re-enter, and then try to apply for citizenship. Whereas if you initially got into the country, did your 5 years of residency, applied for citizenship, then if you do everything right, it's not that long a process. I mean, once you do the 5 years of residency, you can be a citizen in 2 to 3 years. Now, when you hear the horror stories of things that get extended, it's because somebody didn't do something right, or they got arrested, they got involved in a felony charge. Now, I will say this, and I'm gonna be hard on corporate America here, because they are part of the problem, not the solution. And I know tons of businesses, and I've seen them, car washes, you name them, who will hire illegal immigrants, pay them cash under the table because it's cheap, because it's easy labor, because they can get away with it.
Well, and then you've got the whole trafficking industry.
Absolutely.
Who will promise people, that they're going to get them into the country, and they take money for it, and they get them in and dump them or whatever. And,
and the extortion point, where you have a guy, a husband, comes over to the U.S., gets over here, gets his residence. He wants to bring his family in. He goes to an illegal trafficker, which, let's face it, everybody knows the cartels control the Mexican side of the border, and I've seen it firsthand, and I could name off just a few right off. Well, in Tijuana, the AFO, Juarez, the UFCO, and of course the Sinaloa cartel, and they feed on these people. They take advantage of the situation because they engage in the drug smuggling, human trafficking, sex trafficking, extortion, and then of course the kidnapping and the murder. And that is the problem with people who risk illegally entering. And like I mentioned, like you get a guy here, he establishes residency. Oh, I want to bring my family over. And then gets caught up in a mess, and he's going to get extorted, and then who knows?
Yep.
And that's one of the reasons why I think I would like to see a deterrent to illegal immigration, to illegal border crossing. And, again, it's information, to let people know. And, we'll talk about the wall here in a minute, or how effective it is. But deterring illegal immigration, illegal border crossing, and exposing some of the people who are pushing that, because they're pushing an agenda of their own, because they want open borders. And that's part of the problem. That's not part of the solution. That's part of the problem. And these people are being taken advantage of by the worst of what's on the other side of the border. Now, we'll say this, and something that, I don't know, a lot of people probably didn't read in the news. The newly elected Mexican president sent Trump a 7-page letter on it, which he literally addressed the whole situation and said how he would like to make conditions better on their side of the border so people wouldn't want to cross the border and go to the U.S. And when I read that in the news, I was like, are you kidding me?
I haven't heard much about that.
Yeah, well, of course. And that's a whole nother story about the media. I don't even want to get into that here. But that literally was a 7-page letter he sent to Trump about why he wanted to fix the problems on the border. And let's face it, Mexico is taking a beating even on tourism, because some of those classical places that people went to, like Cancun, Cancun and Acapulco, now you're just getting shot.
Yeah, it's gotten bad lately, especially.
Oh, it's terrible. Now, going back to what you said, yeah, what there needs to be is a realistic approach and more information, bringing people here. And like I said, on Trump's travel ban, you got to look at the places he was restricting. If you look at Syria and Yemen and some of those countries that are involved in civil war, full of terrorism, you know what? I kind of want to see a little bit of a restriction there, because the people coming out of there, you don't necessarily know what you get.
I have to say something here, and this is probably not very politically correct, but during the Obama administration, we pretended that everyone was the same, and they're not. For instance, when the Syrian war that started, and before that, when ISIS was devastating the non-Muslim populations in Iraq and areas in that, there were a lot of refugees who were being targeted. And we pretended that everybody was the same. So we didn't treat them any different than anyone else, when we should have been able to receive in people who were being targeted for genocide and
like the Yazidi population in Northern. Right. Oh no, I know exactly who you're talking about. Absolutely.
But so here we are now down the road, and you brought up Syria. Well, there and I know Syria is a conundrum.
Yes, it is.
It really is complicated, and unfortunately, we've done our share to complicate it.
Oh, absolutely.
But we need to have some common sense, and we need to be sensible about these things. And unfortunately, it does become so political that we can't get out of our own way.
Oh, absolutely. And the sad thing is the immigration issue, and like I mentioned before, because it's such a hot topic, and it's almost more emotional than it is logical. You get people, and we go back to the 90s, and like you mentioned about when Clinton and Schumer and everybody were talking tough on immigration. And then, and this is actually, I'm going to bring this up. I sent you the video on it, obviously, and I know you saw it. When the Washington Post ran an article about conditions at the border and children being in cells. And they ran a bunch of pictures. And the great irony in it was that the pictures they ran were from 2014.
Right. I saw that.
And it was a documentary that was run by the Arizona Republic. They sent journalists down to Central America. They sent journalists down to the border. And of course, in the video I sent you, what you saw, one of the journalists in there was so frustrated because the stuff they were running was stuff from 2014. And back then it was completely ignored. It was completely ignored. It was downplayed. And some of the media outlets even went so far as to rebut it, saying, no, this is hyperbole. They're just using children to push an agenda. There's no border crisis, etc. And, the poor guy in the video was saying, look, I tried to bring this up. I was totally ignored. And they were the ones who first started separating families because they said, well, you have adults coming across that are bringing children. They're using children that aren't their own to try and sneak into the country. And then they even set up the DNA testing. They were the ones who started the DNA testing and separating of the families. And none of that really came out. In fact, it was rebutted in a lot of, like I was saying before, rebutted in a lot of papers and media outlets. And then currently you have a digital outlet called the Texas Tribune that's running something similar, but they're doing it with secondhand information, old photos. And again, they're trying to prop up stuff. And it's not that they care about immigration. It's that they're pushing a political agenda and they're strictly trying to bash Trump. And that's just wrong. And while I agree that this is a situation we need to fix, but right now the media is not helping. They're actually doing more harm than good.
I'm no fan of the media myself. That's a whole nother story.
Yeah, no, and I agree. And we've seen the way things that either get underreported or twisted, and that's why I specifically, again, I sent you that video because everyone was making a big deal about the whole border thing. And this is something that's been going on for a long time. And the 2014 expose by the Arizona Republic literally got shoved under the rug and just totally ignored. But now, in the here and now, the big thing is this is a problem that is a voter issue, and it's something that Trump ran on. Now, as far as the wall is concerned, and I want to touch on this, security walls have worked in places like San Diego opposite Tijuana, El Paso opposite Juarez, because those are checkpoints. They're manned 24 hours a day. They have high security fences. But if you look across the entire U.S.-Mexico border, first of all, there's places where it's just geographically impossible to put a wall in. Secondly, just throwing up a wall, if it's not manned or it's not going to discourage people coming across.
We're in agreement on that.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely, we need to discourage and stop illegal border crossing. And again, information. And hopefully, I'm hoping what I heard from the new president-elect in Mexico, I hope that's a positive step. And I say we need to stop illegal border crossing, not because I want to stop immigration, because I want to stop seeing people, particularly adults, subjecting their children to that kind of punishment and abuse. And secondly, putting themselves at risk to the people on the Mexican side who right now control the border area and are the real enemy. I mean, the cartels right now are the enemy.
One thing that I would like to see right now, and I'm kind of preaching to the conservatives,
right?
Is we need to find a way to balance our law and order position with compassion and not be sucked into responding to the extreme on the other side, and not allow them to usurp that moral high ground, which, frankly, I don't know. When people talk about immigration, it's as if the options are open borders or build a wall.
And it's not.
And it's not. And we need to stop playing into that.
Absolutely. No, and I think, like, when we had the 2 executive orders, the DACA and the sanctuary cities, and which I thought the sanctuary cities thing, when you're forcing local law enforcement to literally not cooperate with federal law enforcement, that's wrong. That's just plain wrong. And I'm not saying going after the illegal immigrant that's, overstayed his visa. I'm talking about the hardcore people, like the drug people, the gangbangers. They don't deserve protection. That's what we need to get out of here.
Here's the thing. So I live just outside of Aurora. My kids all went to West Aurora High School.
Right.
So, and if you talk to local law enforcement, they will tell you that if they begin to crack down on enforcement, the problem is that people won't report crime. And so part of the sanctuary city issue is that we don't want to stop people from reporting crime. I'm wholeheartedly in agreement with you that the gangbangers and the hardened criminals need to be rounded up and deported. But it's complicated. And I know it's easy to say. I mean, it is easy to say, if you come in here illegally, that's a crime, too bad. But life is a bit more complicated than that. There's all kinds of stories and extenuating circumstances, and probably a lot of it stems from simply not knowing the laws. And of course, we're all supposed to, be assumed to know the laws, but let's be realistic about it.
Sure.
That just isn't the way things work.
Oh, no.
And this has been a problem that's been building for years, and we had opportunities to streamline immigration and make it workable and cut through the bureaucratic mess. And we haven't had the will to do it. I mean, all we have from the political representatives are people, taking pot shots at each other.
Absolutely.
And stirring up their base. And, honestly, I'm a very, I am not a fan of politics.
Me either.
It's big business.
Yeah.
And all people do on both sides is perpetuate themselves in office, and whatever they can do to perpetuate themselves in office is what they do. And at the end of the day, there's not a whole lot accomplished.
No. And part of, and I will say this, even if you're anti-Trump, one thing I will say that Trump said that was right. When he said to Congress, you want to fix immigration, then you need to fix immigration. And he's right, because Congress is the legislative branch. Congress makes laws.
Right.
I hate the fact that so many presidents now rely on executive orders. That's not the way the system was meant to work. It's not.
It's an easy out for Congress.
Exactly.
They don't have to put themselves on the line. They can just let the president issue an executive order. And then they can either take pot shots at the president or support it, but they're doing it from behind the lines.
Exactly. And the fact is that if you really want a true fix, if you want to find a solution, then Congress has to get off their asses and fix the problem. Make a legislation. And the thing is, again, I say, when I read the Tribune article on the Dreamer thing, and I saw all these guys who've been in the country for all those years, and I said, why didn't you apply for citizenship? Well, that's something that should be pushed. Say, look, here you are. Here's your timeline. Okay, you're here on a student visa. You're going to be here for, say, college, post-grad work, whatever. This is when you need to file. This is when you know, give them a timeline. This is stuff that needs to be communicated, and this is stuff that needs to be accomplished.
Well,
because
the message out there right now, though, especially coming from our president, is, you know, send them back, tough on immigration,
which is wrong. No, I agree. No, yeah. you know, but there's two sides to that, you know, and I want to hold them accountable too. If you're an individual and you are in this country, and particularly educated individuals I'm talking about now, like a guy who's a stockbroker now, has been here for 20 years when he came here at the age of 13. Come on, don't tell me you didn't know that you could file for citizenship, but you just ignored it. And that, you know, I mean, that's my point. There, you know, there's two sides. People have to take individual responsibility, but by the same token, the government has to come up with a plan, has to come up with a fix, and it can't be some kind of stopgap thing. It can't be some kind of like we were talking, executive orders. You know, there has to be some point where logic and common sense, you know, triumphs.
Right.
And you come up to with a solution, you know, and there is a solution. There has to be a way.
It's going to be people having to cross the line, the dividing line between right and left, conservative and liberal. People are going to have to join together and compromise like we used to be able to do to work it out.
Yeah, and I agree. And, you know, when I hear words like, oh, we need to make a pathway or this or that, first of all, and I'm going to be very clear on this, amnesty is not immigration reform, and it is a slap in the face to people who apply for citizenship and gain it legally. Now, having said that, you could easily say to all these people who are here illegally and say, look, okay, here's the deal. You're here legally now. We're going to allow you all to apply for citizenship, but you have to do it now.
Right.
That to me, that is the middle ground, you know, not saying deport, not saying, oh, well, here's a freebie. Say, look, okay, you were brought here illegally as a child. That doesn't entitle you to be a citizen. However, we're going to let you right now apply for citizenship. Do it.
I could support that.
Absolutely. And it's just so simple if you look at it with common sense. But unfortunately, that's, you know, political agendas never incorporate common sense. So, you know, but it's that simple. You don't say, look, okay, yeah, you say, yeah, I've been here for X amount of years and I've worked here and I've never applied. Well, okay, that still doesn't legally entitle you to be a citizen. Now, here's the deal. Boom. Starting now, whatever date you set, you've been here for 5 years, file for citizenship. Do it now. And that can solve the problem.
Yeah, I think so.
You know, otherwise, you know, because we can't continue this way. And I'm hate to point the finger, but if you want to look at illegal immigration or immigration gone totally wrong, you don't have to look any further than California, because they are in a situation right now which is literally economically unsustainable. They contribute, and there's an excellent article on this by a guy who was a former Republican and a member of the California State House, called Adios California, and go ahead and look it up online. It's outstanding, and he points into all the things that the state has completely gotten wrong. And one of the things that glaringly stands out, and if you look at two of the largest SMAs, which stands for Statistical metropolitan areas. That's an economic term. You look at the Bay Area, which includes Oakland and San Francisco. You look at San Diego and Los Angeles. You look at Title II, which is support to illegal immigrants in schooling all the way through high school. If you look at the amount of money they pay to support illegal immigrants, it's astounding. They say, well, they contribute X amount of money to the economy, but right now they're costing California taxpayers $23 billion a year.
So we get them on the road to citizenship.
Exactly.
Get them paying income taxes.
Exactly.
Social Security. Yeah.
Exactly.
And we need workers. We need people to sustain the systems that we've got for our aging population.
Well, just for economic sustainment anyway. I mean, we have a good GDP right now in the U.S., but I will again point to California. California has this phenomenal GDP, but the key word in GDP being gross. But when you factor in their debt, their welfare payments, both federal and national, which they lead the country in, and you look at a state right now that is in an unsustainable position. And they are in a crisis, and they're at the top of this heap that we're calling about the illegal immigration system. And like I mentioned, and I think we're both in agreement on, you have to figure out a way to fix a situation and make these people, and I say make these people file for citizenship. And part of the problem, and I hate to bring this up, and I'm going to talk a little bit about personal experience, but, some of these people, and I'll walk into the McDonald's right down the road here, and I'll be the only person speaking English in there on a given day, is you can marque dos para español, bilingual menus, and the fact that, we have the sanctuary cities. No, stop it. Stop. Fix the situation. Say, look, start from day one. You people need to integrate, learn the language, file for citizenship. And I dealt with this. I've been in the rental property industry for 18 years after I retired from the Army. I've dealt with contractors. And don't get me wrong. I mean, the landscaping and the roofers, particularly, who are largely Hispanic, are phenomenal. They do a good job. But then when I get a guy who dumps a bucket of roofing nails off the side of the building into the alleyway, and I got to talk to him, I'm like, when I try to talk to him. I know a little bit of Spanish. Yo hablo un poco español, pero necesito muchas práctica. And I talk to him a little bit in Spanish and try and pointy talk, and he tries to play dumb on me. And then I got to call their home office and say, look, send me somebody out here who speaks English. That's a problem. When I get a guy who's a handyman and he's been in the landscaping business for 10 or 12 years, and all I want him to do is cut the grass, and I've got a lawn boy and I've got a Toro, one that takes gas only, one that takes a mixture, and I have the can marked mixture gas only, but he puts the gas in the lawn boy, which is a 2-stroke, because he can't read. And thank God one of the cleaning staff caught him before he started the thing up, but I still had to have it go drain. That's a problem. Integration is part of this. And that's why I say, we need to push citizenship. We need to push integration. We need to push people to say, hey, look, even though the United States doesn't have a declared official language other than the military does have a declared official language is English. Everything we do business in is in English. And if you've been in the country 10, 20 years and you still can't speak, read, or write the language, there's a problem. And all this goes towards pushing the same thing. And I want to see these people who are here, who are hardworking, be integrated in the society. And become citizens. And that's part of the process that we need to fix.
Well, I think, a lot of times we give examples, and the examples are certainly true, but they're anecdotal. And
oh, absolutely.
And they don't speak for everyone. And
of course they don't speak for everyone.
There were Japanese and German and Italian and Vietnamese and others who have emigrated, and some of them haven't learned English in 10 years. I mean, it's a challenge, obviously.
Yeah.
But I think part of the answer is having a system that is accommodating and easy to follow and understand, and well publicized, that gets people on a road to citizenship.
Absolutely. And I think the key word is information. Yes, no, absolutely. Right. I'm 100% agreement with you.
So, so we don't have people who languish, and we don't have people who don't understand American democracy. And, we need to educate these people and get them through the process to citizenship so they can become productive. And I don't think we have a system that does that right now.
No, we don't. We don't. Absolutely not. And like I said, again, I am 100% against just blanket amnesty, because that's not fair to the people who did it right. But by the same token, I say, okay, look, here you are. You were here illegally. You're going to start from square one. Apply for citizenship now. This is your time frame. Because, like I said, if you go to the Bureau of Immigration site, 5 years is a residency requirement. Of course, most of these people have been here longer than 5 years. They've been here. They're working. The fact that they're undocumented or illegal, whatever term you want to use. But at some point, say, okay, look, now's the time. Go. We're going to forgive, the fact that you came, that you overstayed your visa or you crossed the border illegally, but now you've got to apply. And just do it.
Agreed.
Unfortunately, as long as politics are involved and as long as people are pushing an agenda, that is the biggest threat to common sense and logic.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunately, that's the thing that we, and you and I are both relatively conservative. We're both Christian, but that's what the voters have to communicate, to our representatives. And it's hard to do.
Yeah. As you know, from seeing me on social media, I tend to take, I guess, what some people might call a more progressive public stance on these issues. And you're right. At the core, I'm conservative, but more importantly, I'm Christian.
Right.
And I think, like I said, I think we've lost the high ground.
Right.
And somehow we need to regain that high ground and try to push toward the middle and bring people together and stop playing into the political ping pong game that is, the media tries to perpetuate, because that's what sells.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That sells news.
Yep.
Yeah, that's that's the other sad reality about all of this, because if you could throw a starving kid on a front page and push it as an issue, bang, you're going to sell papers. And I think, again, it's a hot button topic, but it's definitely something that's got to be solved. And like I said before, earlier in the program, if that's the number one concern, according to a Gallup poll, and again, I say a Gallup poll, like Pew Research, which is an actual poll. And let's face it, what got Trump elected? Part of what got Trump elected was his stance on immigration. Yep. It is a serious front topic for the voters.
Well, I think what got Trump elected is that we spent 8 years where we couldn't talk openly about the real
No.
issues.
Nope.
And
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
we have someone who comes along who doesn't give a hoot about political correctness, and I think
Nope.
people found that refreshing. Now, I have to say, I am not a Trump supporter. I am not pro-Trump, and I think he does a lot of damage by his mouth. And
Oh yeah.
but I'm also not. I wouldn't call myself anti-Trump. It drives me crazy that all we see on social media and all we see in the news, it's like a bunch of schoolyard tattletales.
Absolutely.
He did this, he did that. Look what he did now. That drives me absolutely up the wall.
Me too.
But I am not a Trump supporter, and I think he does damage by like a bull in a china shop. And I cringe at at the way we're going at this point myself.
Well, and I look at it the same way. I was not I couldn't stand Obama, but I wasn't somebody who literally 24/7, like I'm seeing now, post every single thing, anti-Obama. And I see this now with people who are so obsessed with it, they're not seeing clearly anymore. It's like it's almost bizarre. But I didn't vote for Trump. However, some of the things he's done, I like. A lot of the stuff, like the Twitter stuff, I don't like. I don't like him running his mouth all the time. But this specific issue is something that at least he's trying to address. Maybe not. Again, I'm not a fan of the wall, but really, and we're both in agreement. Congress is the ones who needs to get off their asses and solve this problem because they are the legislative branch. End of the day, that is their job, and they're not doing it.
Right.
And that means not the Democrats, not the Republicans. And I'm not a Republican. I'm an independent conservative.
Yeah, I am not either. I don't know what I am. I don't have a party.
Yeah, I don't. But I know my beliefs, and I'm an independent conservative. Right. And that's the way I vote. I vote issues. I vote candidates.
Right.
I'm not definitely, I'm not into either party, and actually the guy, even though he had no chance of winning, Jim Webb from South Carolina, Democrat, I like a lot. Had he been the Democratic Party candidate, I'd have voted for him in a minute.
Yeah.
But that's politics.
Yep.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up, and I just want to say, hopefully, I know we didn't have a lot of live views, but those of you who get a chance to watch this on archive, have an open mind. Look at this, when we talk about immigration, legal immigration, look at this with an open mind, but realize this is something that is definitely a problem in this country and definitely something that has got to be solved. And that's one thing I know he and I are both in agreement on.
Yep.
All right. So this is Mac Boland, and I'm going to go ahead and say good night. Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate you coming on. My next podcast for Seriously People 3 is going to be on economics, and I'm going to have somebody on it, Jason Butler, and we're going to talk economics up and down. And folks, if you want to get educated, bust out your pen and paper because we are going top to bottom, and I'm going to cover everything from capitalism, socialism, and the 2007 recession, GDP, public sector unions, the Banking Act of 1933, steel glass. If you don't know it, then you need to. And I'm going to go into all kinds of stuff. And this guy is the perfect person. He's got an MBA, he lives in Texas, and you'll know why he lives in Texas. And let's just say, no state income tax for part of it. But that's a tease for next week. And so we talked immigration tonight. Again, Kevin, thank you so much for coming on here. God bless you, brother.
Thank you. You're welcome.
And hopefully, everybody, you learned something. You enjoyed it. I invite your comments. Again, this will be archived on YouTube. You can watch it anytime. Have a good evening, folks.